Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Animal Welfare Group Nigeria. I'm happy to have each and every one of you join today's webinar. And just a brief introduction about what the Animal Welfare Group Nigeria is about. And before I do that, I am Iyasiri Oluwaseun-Sira. I'm the coordinator of the group. And I'm happy to tell you that our mission is to increase awareness in animal behavior and welfare, to foster collaboration among researchers who are doing one or two things in animal behavior and welfare, irrespective of the species that they are working with, and also to educate the public on the importance of animal behavior and welfare, because there is still this huge gap and we need to let people understand the importance of this. And that is mostly what we do on our webinars and also inaugural lectures. Today we have Ricardo Lemos in our midst. He's our speaker, and he'll be talking to us on zoo animals and research, the applications to animal welfare and beyond.
Good afternoon, everybody here from Nigeria, and we are happy to have everyone joining us. And we hope this will be an exciting moment again for everyone. Thank you for joining. I am Hayola Oluyemi. I'm a researcher here at Afe Babalola University, Ado-Ekiti, Nigeria. And we have our speaker this afternoon, the person of Ricardo, and I will write a little citation about him. Thank you. Ricardo is an applied animal behavioral scientist, currently working as a lecturer and conservation project manager at Bristol Zoological Society, United Kingdom. He started his career as a volunteer zookeeper at Lisbon Zoo in 2007 and has been then worked with several zoos and other organizations in conservation, research, education, and animal care projects stroke positions. Ricardo's main interests include animal behavior and welfare, conservation, breeding, and reintroduction science, and science communication. Ricardo is also the founder of the Zoo Scientist, a website and social media channel created to disseminate news, scientific papers, job opportunity, and other resources on zoo conservation, research, and education. And it's my honor to welcome you for your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so hello everyone. Again, I'm Ricardo. I've already been introduced. Today I will be talking about zoo-based research and all the diverse applications that research on zoo animals can have, which include animal welfare, yes, but it goes beyond that. It also includes conservation, education, as you will see throughout this presentation. My background has already been introduced, but again, yes, I have a background in animal behavior from an undergraduate degree, a bachelor degree. I've done animal behavior. I also did a master's by research in wildlife behavior and conservation at University of Chester. And as part of that master's, I conducted a multi-zoo research project on mouse deer. So mouse deer, for those who may not know, not everyone knows what a mouse deer is. Mouse deer is an ungulate. So they're not really a true deer. They have their own family. They're kind of cousins to real deer, but they are in their own family group, which is called the tragalids. They're also known as chevrotains. There is one African species, but most mouse deer species are from Asia. Yes, and I conducted a multi-zoo study across zoos, and I will be talking in more detail about this study because it's one of the examples I provide in this presentation. More recently, I also did a PhD in applied animal behavior at University of Birmingham, and my PhD project was about parrots behavior in captivity and how we can encourage or enable natural behaviors by modifying their enclosure and the management in zoos and other ex situ facilities. In terms of work experience, again, as it was already mentioned, but I started as a volunteer zookeeper at Lisbon Zoo. I'm originally from Portugal, so Lisbon Zoo was my home zoo growing up. And I started in 2007. Since then, I worked with multiple zoos and multiple organizations in positions like animal care, so zookeeper, but also research and conservation positions and collaborations. And one of the positions that I also like to mention, because it's a project that's very dear to me, is the conservation program for the Iberian lynx. So the Iberian lynx is a species that was on the brink of extinction not long ago. But thanks to a captive breeding and reintroduction program in Portugal and Spain, this species has recovered and it's doing much better now. I was part of their team in 2015 as part of the behavioral monitoring program. So all the captive lynx were monitored 24/7, also to assess their behaviors and see if they were ready to be reintroduced into the wild. But I will explain that further in a minute. Again, as mentioned, I'm a founder of the Zoo Scientist, which is a zoo science page that I created in 2015 with the goal of disseminating the role of zoos in conservation, research, education, animal welfare. And it's been growing and it's been gaining popularity, and it's now used by many people, not just zoo professionals or wildlife professionals, but also students and aspiring professionals, and the general public as well. I'm also a member of the BIAZA Research Committee, which is the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums. Within the committee, I'm the head of the Research Engagement Group, which works about, it's about research partnerships and about disseminating the research work conducted by BIAZA members. And as mentioned, I'm currently a lecturer and conservation project manager at Bristol Zoological Society in Bristol, United Kingdom, which is a wildlife charity that also runs Bristol Zoo Project. At Bristol Zoological Society, I am a lecturer in animal behavior and communication for conservation because the zoo is partnered with several local universities. And as a zoo employee, I'm also a lecturer in those universities. I'm also a project manager under the zoo's conservation program in the Philippines. So Bristol Zoo has several conservation projects and partners in the Philippines, which include working with local communities in Panay, which is one of the islands in the Philippines. And we're working with local communities to reduce illegal hunting in the national park, which is affecting a lot of threatened species, including the Visayan warty pig, which is a wild pig species that is critically endangered and it's very affected by illegal hunting. We are also partners with organizations that are breeding species for reintroduction, including the Negro's bleeding heart dove, which is a critically endangered species that we are helping to breed in captivity for reintroduction into the wild. I'm also an advisor in the animal behavior and welfare program at the zoo. So I work with the animal behavior and welfare team in various projects, behavior and welfare projects within Bristol Zoo Project. But moving on to the actual presentation. So today, again, I will be talking about the applications of zoo-based research. Now, I will be focusing on zoo-based behavioral research, and that is because, as I just said, that is my background. That's my main research interest. But many of the things that I will be talking about also apply to other types of zoo-based research, like genetics or physiology, or even the social sciences. I'm just focusing on behavioral research in terms of examples, because again, that is my mostly my background. Some of the things that I will be talking about are adapted from a chapter that I published in a recent book in the Behavioral Biology of Zoo Animals. I published a chapter within that book exactly on the topic of behavioral biology and applied zoo research. So how we can, all the potential applications of zoo-based research. And this is just a diagram to give you an overview of all the potential applications of zoo-based research, and then I will go into each one in more detail. But before we go into applied science, just a brief mention that zoo-based behavioral research can also contribute to fundamental science, whose main goal is to advance our knowledge of animal behavior or natural world, natural biology in general. Of course, this type of science, fundamental science, has applications and can be very useful for welfare, conservation, etc. But usually when research is conducted under fundamental science, the main goal is just to advance our knowledge of a particular topic. On the other hand, we've also got applied science, which will be the focus of this presentation, which is when we conduct research for specific goals and objectives, such as ex situ conservation. So when we conduct research whose findings are to inform ex situ conservation, for those that may not know, ex situ conservation is conservation outside the natural habitat, which include, for example, captive breeding and reintroduction programs. It can also be applied to in situ conservation, and that is research that is conducted in the natural habitat, for example, habitat restoration, anti-poaching campaigns, etc., etc. Animal welfare, of course, zoo-based research. A lot of research that is conducted at the zoo is to understand and improve the welfare of the zoo animals. And finally, we can also use zoo-based research to understand, assess, and improve the experience and education of zoo visitors, who are, of course, a major stakeholder of the zoo environment. But starting with ex situ conservation. So again, ex situ conservation outside the natural habitat, which may be, for example, conservation translocations, which is when we deliberately move animals from one location to the other for conservation purposes, such as the reintroduction of captive bred animals. And conservation translocations can be a very effective conservation strategy, and they have been responsible for the rescue of many species that were on the brink of extinction. I already mentioned the Iberian lynx as such example that were very close to the extinction, but thanks to a captive breeding program and reintroduction, of course, in combination with in situ efforts. Of course, this type of conservation actions, reintroducing captive bred animals, for example, has to be done alongside other measures such as habitat protection, habitat restoration, anti-poaching, etc., etc. Other examples of species that have benefited greatly from ex situ conservation include the Przewalski's horse that have been reintroduced from zoos and were pretty much extinct in the natural habitat. We have other examples like the European bison, the Hawaiian geese, and there are several others, the black-footed ferret, Arabian oryx. There are many, many species that were either extinct in the wild or very close to go extinct in the wild that have recovered thanks to conservation translocations and reintroduction efforts. However, one of the major challenges of reintroducing captive bred animals into the wild is that the captivity, the captive environment, has a strong effect on the behavior of the animals, meaning that animals in captivity tend to lose their natural behaviors, meaning that they may lose their ability, their behaviors, their skills to survive and reproduce in the wild. And if we look at this graph on the left from a study from 2008, we can see that the reintroduction of carnivores, when they were captive born, there was a higher rate of deaths by starvation, interactions with other species, human-related, recapture, and this all means that captive bred animals that are reintroduced in comparison to wild-caught animals may struggle with some of the behavioral skills that they don't have because of that effect of captivity. However, on the bright side, that's where behavioral research, and this may include zoo-based behavioral research, comes to the rescue, because we can use it to monitor and assess the behavior of captive animals to then investigate whether those animals have the necessary behaviors and the necessary skills for survival and reproduction in the wild. And if they don't, then we can apply evidence-based modifications to their enclosure, to the husbandry, to the management, to try and encourage those behaviors and then see if they become more prepared to be reintroduced into the wild. Now, as we're talking specifically about zoo-based research, it's good to reiterate that most zoo animals will not be reintroduced into the wild. Maybe zoos have contributed to many reintroduction programs, either with actual animals for release, but also with financial support, expertise, human resources. So zoos contribute greatly to reintroduction efforts, but that doesn't mean that most animals that are currently at the zoo will be themselves reintroduced into the wild. They will not. However, their offspring or future generations may be, because zoo animals are often kept as part of long-term breeding programs. And we call them insurance populations because they are kept in zoos as insurance to extinction, meaning that if things go wrong in the wild or suddenly in the future there is a need to either boost population numbers in the wild or reestablish a species in the wild, we can get source zoo animals for release into the wild. And that can be seen, for example, in Europe, in the European Association of Zoos and Aquariums and their members. They have what we call the EEP, which is the European Ex situ program. And there's EEPs for multiple species. And under those ex situ programs, zoos collaborate with each other to exchange animals and breed animals in order to keep a captive population that is genetically, demographically healthy, that can be used for reintroduction efforts in the future if necessary. But again, we have the same challenge. Captive animals are susceptible to loss of natural behaviors. And if they are in captivity in the long term, meaning if you have a species in captivity for many generations, then the susceptibility to lose or modify natural behaviors is even greater. So again, we can use behavioral research to keep monitoring and assessing the behavior of zoo-housed animals and ensuring they are retaining the behavioral repertoire of their wild conspecifics in the long term. Now, we already addressed the applications of zoo-based research for ex situ conservation, and now we will be talking how we can use research at the zoo to inform research and conservation in the natural habitat, so in situ. So we can conduct research on zoo animals to help in the development, testing, and refinement of technologies, methodologies for research and conservation on wild animals. For example, this has been done before. For example, there was a study published in 2020 where accelerometers were calibrated for behavioral data. So the goal was to record activity budgets of wild swans using accelerometers. But for the accelerometers to work, to record behavioral data, they have to be calibrated first. They have to be the certain, parameters of the accelerometer have to be linked with certain behaviors. And that was calibrated using zoo-housed swans. So the zoo-housed swans, which were obviously more habituated to people, there was easier access to them. They were used to calibrate those accelerometers, and those accelerometers were then used on free-living animals. And it was found that this calibration using captive animals was highly accurate. And of course, we can already see how much easier it is to do this calibration, this refinement, this development of technologies on captive animals first, which are more accessible and less susceptible to stress of being handled by people, because usually captive animals, again, are more used to people than wild animals. So there's less ethical issues of trialing a certain methodology or technology on a captive animal first. And once it's been refined to the best of our abilities, then move on to use that same technology on wild animals. Another great example, there was a robot that was developed to approach and collect data on wild penguin colonies in Antarctica. However, before this robot was used with wild penguins in Antarctica, it was tested and refined with captive penguin colony at Paris Zoo. So the goal was to make sure that the design of the robot and all the specifications were done so they wouldn't disturb the animals. And the first point was to see if the zoo-housed penguins were disturbed by the presence of the robot. And with that, they were able to refine the robot to a design that worked well with the captive penguins. And after that, when it was refined and developed, it could then be used with wild penguins in Antarctica. So again, this is another example how we can refine these methodologies, the technology that can be very useful for research and conservation. For example, monitoring behavior and populations of wild animals can be very challenging, and we need technology and methodology to help us in that task. And to develop those, we can have the help of zoo-housed animals as a starting point. Another application or potential application of zoo-based research is visitor education and experience. So, of course, zoos have a recreation goal as well. So, zoos were initially, and historical zoos were created mostly for recreation and entertainment. They have evolved since to become institutions that contribute to conservation, research, and education as well. But visitors, the visitor education and experience is still a big part of the zoo environment and very, very important. So we have to make sure that zoos, when visitors go to a zoo, that they have a good time, because that's still one of the goals of zoos, and also that they are being educated about wildlife, about conservation. And we can use zoo-based research for that. We can combine animal behavior with research with the social sciences to evaluate and improve visitor education and experience, and also to inform conservation education practices in other settings outside the zoo. We can use this knowledge that we get from zoo-based research on education to inform conservation education in other settings, as we will see an example in a minute. And again, this has been shown before. There's been shown that visitors that are watching animals displaying active behaviors showed positive emotional responses, which also influenced what they were learning in the zoo environment. So this means that, animal behavior in the zoo is an important aspect of the visitor experience and visitor education. So conducting zoo-based research on the animals and on the visitors with social sciences can help us perfecting the impact of zoos on the recreational and educational experience of their visitors. And also, again, we can use those findings so we can perfect methodologies for education and behavior change in the zoo that we can then try to replicate in other settings. And this was a paper published in 2007 that showed how we can use lessons, how we can use data, findings, evidence from research in zoos and aquariums to inform conservation learning in wildlife tourism, for example. So tourism in the wild with safaris, for example, we can use zoo-based research, findings from zoo-based research to perfect education in the wildlife tourism. So again, the applications of zoo-based research extend beyond the actual zoo. We can use them to inform other industries, other settings. And of course, animal welfare. Animal welfare is now a big priority of zoos. Again, I know by saying zoos, I'm generalizing a lot, but for this presentation, I'm referring to accredited zoos that do prioritize animal welfare. And a big part of animal welfare is research. And for animal welfare at the zoo, I have to, of course, mention the 5 domains model of animal welfare, which is a model that is actually endorsed and recommended in the welfare strategy of the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, WAZA. And under this model, animal welfare is assessed based on 4 physical or functional domains: nutrition, environment, physical health, and behavior, which then lead to the 5th domain, which is the mental domain of the animal, which refers to positive and negative experiences for the animal. For example, positive experiences include playfulness, curiosity, vitality, reward, security. while negative experiences include pain, fear, distress, boredom, frustration, and all of these combined then result in the overall welfare status of the animal. And as you can see, research can integrate each one of them. So, in order to provide positive, appropriate nutrition, we need to conduct research to understand what's the best nutrition for that animal under human care. Same for the environment. To provide opportunity and choice for the animals, we have to conduct research to understand what's the best possible environment we can provide to the animals. Same for physical health, animal health, and veterinary research to understand the health of the animal, if the animal is fit and able and free of disease and injury. And of course, behavior, again, the focus of this presentation, in order to ensure animals are expressing positive behavior or opportunities for behavioral expression and are not being restricted to express certain behaviors. It's important to assess and monitor the behavior of the animals to understand this. So the key is we need an evidence-based approach to animal husbandry and management. So in order to optimize or to improve welfare in captive animals, we cannot rely on traditional knowledge, meaning I've always done it this way, so that's how I'm going to keep doing it. That's still an issue, unfortunately, but that's something we have to move away from and instead rely on an evidence-based approach, which is, of course, completely dependent on research. And I'm going to give a few examples of previous papers, not my own papers, not my own research. I will present some of that in a minute. But for now, it's previous papers from other authors, other researchers that really highlight how we can use zoo-based research to improve an evidence-based approach to animal husbandry and management and consequently welfare. In this case, it's an example of a study that shows that zoo-housed lesser anteaters, they were given a choice of food items where they could choose to eat termites or ants, and each one of them has different nutritional values. And it was very clearly shown that the captive lesser anteaters preferred termites over ants, because even though ants had higher nutritional values, the termites showed higher digestibility. And this is the kind of study that we can link behavior with nutrition to better understand the best way to feed the animal from a nutritional point of view, but also while providing opportunity for natural foraging behaviors in a particular species. Another example, a study that showed that the effects of UV light or UV radiance on Komodo dragon behavior and health. And it was found that Komodo dragons with access to the outdoors had increased, because of course they had more access to natural light. They also had increased vitamin D3, and the females also showed increased egg laying. For Komodo dragons that were kept indoors, but with a high UV radiance, they showed increased locomotion and decreased inactivity. So there's here a clear sign that lighting UV is very, very important for Komodo dragon, and it helps informing us the best way of keeping it either outdoors with other access to outdoors, or if that's not possible, then at least provide appropriate lighting indoors in order to improve the welfare, behavior and welfare of the animal. An enrichment study, of course. So zoo-based research is also very important in order to evaluate whether a certain enrichment strategy that's being used for an animal in a zoo works or not. So is it successful at improving behavior and welfare or not? And this is also a very recent study that looked into the impacts of a commercial bubble curtain, which is water pressure in the water that created like bubbles and water movement. And the goal was to see if it would encourage swimming behavior in zoo-housed penguins. And it was found that it did not. It was not effective. And these studies are very important, even when showing the enrichment was not effective, because what we want is obviously to prioritize enrichment that works and that benefits the welfare of the animal. If it doesn't, we're just wasting our time and our resources for no reason. So it's very important to have research clearly evaluating whether enrichment is impactful or not. And finally, a last example for animal welfare showing that uh, what's the visitor effect? So can the presence of visitors at the zoo affect the behavior and welfare of animals? There have been plenty of studies across species on this topic. In this case was on big cats in zoos, and it was found that the visitors had an impact on increasing inactivity. So animals were more inactive when visitors were present, and it was the case for most of the big cats that were studied. This was just for a few number of animals in one zoo, so it was a case study, but it's still quite interesting to see if the visitors are having an effect on the behavior and welfare of the animals, then we need mitigation strategies to try and reduce that effect. And again, zoo-based research is key in that task. Just a note again that zoo-based research can also be used to inform animal welfare across industries. And there was a paper published a few years ago that really calls for that, really highlights the need for zoos, farms, agriculture, and labs to collaborate with each other in terms of sharing not just data and findings, but also share methodologies, technologies that were used, practices, anything that can help improving the welfare of every animal that's under human care. There's historical, it's been mostly one way for zoos in the sense that historical, it's been mostly zoos that have been using data on farm animals to inform their own practices. But there is great potential to be mutually beneficial collaborations that all animal based industries can help each other informing animal welfare. This is just an example that shows that zoo-based research can indeed help informing practices in farm, animal husbandry, and welfare. This is an example of a paper encouraging enrichment and improve animal welfare in farms by using instrumental behavior as a technique to improve welfare in farm animals. And when we look at the paper, they actually cite the successful example of zoos. So zoos have been successful in implementing this strategy to improve animal welfare in their animals. Therefore, this is a way of encouraging the use of this strategy in farm animals. So this is a rather indirect, yes, but still beneficial way for zoos to inform and help improving welfare in other animal-based industries. But again, we should be going further than this. There should be very direct, solid partnerships across animal-based industries to improve animal welfare of all animals under human care. And now I will be giving examples of my own research. Again, this is my mouse deer research. I already introduced the mouse deer a little bit. I published, this was done as part of my master's by research back in 2016, 2017. I published this study back in 2021. And again, there were two species included in this study, the lesser mouse deer, and which has been in European zoos for over 40 years. And it was like in over 20 institutions at the time. The other species is the Philippine mouse deer, which is much rarer. It's an endangered species, and it's only been in European zoos for over a decade. So it's a much rarer species. This was a multi-zoo project. So I collected behavioral data in 15 zoos in 9 European countries. And I also sent husbandry and management questionnaires to all zoos that housed these species. And the goal was to compare the behavior, the husbandry practices, and the breeding success of these animals across different zoos. And it was to see what were some zoos doing right that made them being very successful in breeding these animals, while other zoos could not breed them at all. So we wanted to see exactly what aspects of husbandry and management were having an effect on behavior and breeding success in European zoos. Main findings, we found that vegetation cover was very, very important, which is not surprising because mouse deer are a tropical forest species. So in the wild, they rely on vegetation for cover. They are a prey species to many predators. So of course, they feel safe surrounded by vegetation. We also found that vegetation cover did not decrease the animal's visibility, which is very good from a visitor point of view, meaning that we can increase vegetation cover in the enclosure, which is beneficial for the animals. But because of that, they are more active, they feel more safe, so they move around more, they forage around more, they are still visible to the visitors, so everyone is happy. We also found that the presence of water ponds had a positive effect on foraging behavior. And that is because in the wild, they tend to forage near water sources, which could be because of water requirements, as well as, young vegetation around water sources. So they tend to forage in those areas, which is probably why in captivity, they also feel motivated to forage near these surfaces. Browse also improved breeding success. And these are ruminants, so it's unsurprising that browse is beneficial for these animals. And of course, enrichment, which in this case was mostly scatter feeding and was very successful at improving locomotion and foraging behavior in these animals. These findings were used to update the husbandry guidelines for the species in the European Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And again, because of that, it was used to encourage evidence-based practices in this taxon, which is very understudied, even though it's been in zoos for a long time. There's very little research on them. And these findings were very important to, again, update those guidelines and make sure zoos are relying on evidence. Moving on to my parrot research now. This was the project I conducted as part of my PhD, and it was again all about enabling wild type or natural behaviors in captive parrots. Started by baseline, so looking at the behavior of the parrots, which for my study was the scarlet macaw and the African gray parrots, which are two species. Of course, scarlet macaw, Central and South American species. African gray parrot is, of course, an African species. And they're both very common in captivity, not just in zoos, but also in sanctuaries, and also kept as pets, as domestic animals. That's why they were selected for this study. Initially, we looked at their behavior in their original conditions, in their original enclosure, and we then compared that behavior with available literature on their behavior in the wild. For the scarlet macaw, because unfortunately there was not as much data on their wild natural behavior as I hoped, so I managed to also go to Costa Rica to collect behavioral data on wild scarlet macaws for comparison. And that was the goal: observe their baseline behavior, compare with the behavior of their wild conspecifics. The second step was to suggest and implement enclosure modifications to try and encourage the natural behaviors that we found were missing or underrepresented. And some of the modifications included, I'm just going to give an overview because I don't have the time to go through them all, but the goal was to encourage flying and climbing, which are two behaviors that parrots are very good at. They're very good at climbing and they're very good at flying. So what we did was we increased the structural complexity, the number of supports in the enclosure, but we also reorganized them. So the corners of the enclosure, each corner of the enclosure was an area of high structural complexity, kind of a tree. Let's think that each corner mimics a tree, while the middle areas of the enclosure were kept not fully free, but relatively free to make sure they had clear paths to fly from one end to the other. So we wanted them to climb, but also to fly within the space they had available. Other modifications included suspended feeders, which were in box with a tray with the food inside, with holes. So they had to search in different holes to kind of encourage some foraging behavior. We also put some curtains on the mesh, either ropes or branches on certain areas of the mesh. So when they were climbing on the mesh, it wasn't such a repetitive, boring behavior, and they had a bit more challenge and complexity on their climbing. And for the scarlet macaws, we also used a clay frame, meaning that we used clay, commercial clay for pet parrot, and we kind of smeared it on a frame to put it on their enclosure to encourage a natural behavior that's known as geophagy. So scarlet macaws and other parrots, neotropical parrots, they engage in clay eating behavior, which may have several functions. There are many theories, which include nutritional supplementation, but also to neutralize toxins in their diet. So there's several theories why they engage in this behavior, but it seems to be a very important behavior for them in the wild, and we try to encourage that in the captivity as well. And finally, after the modifications, more behavioral observations to see if the modifications we implemented were successful at encouraging natural behaviors in the captive parrots. These are just some examples of, the actual modifications that took place. This is a scarlet macaw enclosure, but for the African greys was quite similar. As you can see, the before modifications, the corners were actually very clear. So there were not a lot of opportunities for them to climb. There was some support here, but there was not a lot. So we, in the after, we increased the complexity of the structural supports. So we added a lot of supports of different orientation, different thickness, different stability. We filled in the corners as much as possible, top corners as well, so they can be as high as possible, like they do in the wild when they're really high up on the trees. Here in the middle, you can't see very well, but we also put branches on some areas of the mesh, like I said, to interrupt the paths, so they had to be a bit more of a challenge when climbing around. And in the middle, you can't see very well, but there are clear paths for them to fly from one end of the enclosure to the other. There are also suspended feeder, and the clay lake was over there. Again, highlighting high perches in the wild. Parrots may come to the ground or occasionally for forage or etc., but they mostly stay high up on the trees because that's where they're safe from predators. So we wanted to give them the opportunity and the choice to be as high as possible within their enclosure. So we provide them plenty of supports, and as you can see, they really went for it. They really liked it. They really like to be as high as possible in those really high perches. And here is a behavior that I think demonstrates quite well what I was saying about climbing on the mesh versus climbing on the perches. So this is the same animal. I should put the video on. This is the same animal before and after the modifications. And you can see the type of climbing before the modifications. The type of climbing is very repetitive. If you notice, there's no challenge. They don't even have to think about the next step. They kind of go in a repetitive motion to one end to the other. There you go. Now, when they have some obstacles on the mesh, suddenly they can no longer climb in a repetitive way. Oh, sorry, that's not the one I want. I want this one. As you can see, with some obstacles on the mesh, suddenly it has to show more types of climbing behavior. He also has to consider the next step it's going to take. It still uses a little bit of the mesh, but it doesn't just rely on the mesh. Suddenly, it has to use supports with different stability, different orientation, different thickness, and that provides not only increased challenges in cognition and locomotion, because in the wild, that's what they have to do. They have a wide variety of trees they have to climb throughout, and they're all different, and they have to be quite good at it in order to forage. So we wanted to encourage the same type of behaviors in captivity. Okay? Now, this is a video of them engaging in that geophagy behavior using the clay wall, the clay lake that we replicated in the zoo. This is an image in Peru. So this image here is not only scarlet macaws, but ring-winged macaws, blue and yellow macaws, eating clay, ingesting clay on a clay lake. So this is a natural behavior in the wild. And this is the captive macaws engaging with the enrichment in the zoo. So as you can see, they kind of, some of the behaviors they replicated, they were on the wall, they were ingesting the clay, or at least manipulating the clay, so that we managed to replicate this important natural behavior in captivity. And this is them just using the suspended feeder, the African gray parrots. As you can see, because the suspended feeder can only be accessed either by flying or by climbing down on the wire or the ropes that increase the locomotion. So for them to reach the food, they have to climb or they have to fly, so increase locomotion. And also they have to search for the food in the different holes within the little box with the feeders. So summary of main findings with this study. There was a lot of intra and interspecific variability, so not all parrots responded the same way to the modifications. However, as an overall summary of findings, there was an increase in activity, so the animals were more active. They spent more time in behaviors like moving and foraging, and less time just sitting down on a perch. They used more complex supports, which is something we really wanted to do. In baseline, they spent a lot of time just using very basic perches, like horizontal, thick, stable perches. And we wanted them to use more complex supporters. Again, like they do in the wild, they forage on many different trees that are all different, and they are very good at climbing and moving between those different supports. And because of the modifications and increase in complexity of supports, they showed a wide diversity of climbing behaviors. As you've seen in the photos, they also spent more time high up in the enclosure. Again, parrots in the wild, apart from very specific parrot species, but at least these two species, they may come on the ground sometimes. African gray parrots have been seen on the ground foraging and also eating soil. But in general, they prefer to be high up on the trees because that's where they're safe from predators. So we wanted them to spend less time on the ground in the zoo and more time high up in the enclosure. And in terms of locomotions, there was different responses from each species. So the African gray parrots spent more time flying in response to the modifications, while the scarlet macaws spent more time climbing as in response to the modification. So this was a quite interesting different response in behaviors between species. Applications of this study, of course, inform management and husbandry of parrots under human care, improve the welfare and conservation of potential of captive parrots, make sure they are displaying the wild type behaviors. So if they have to be reintroduced, or if they're part of a reintroduction program in the future, they close to the wild type behavioral repertoire of their wild conspecifics. And again, this is applicable to parrots in zoos and sanctuaries, in rescue centers, but also pets. Like I said, the many parrots that are kept as pets. It's estimated that 50 million parrots of all species are kept under human care. Most of them will be domestic in a domestic environment as pets. And therefore, these findings that were conducted in the zoo environment can also be applied to the way we keep these animals in our homes as pets. So, summary, research on zoo animals has many applications, which include conservation, both outside natural habitat like captive breeding and reintroduction, as well as in the natural habitat, because it can help developing and refining methodologies for research and conservation on wild animals. It can help us understanding and evaluating the experience and education of visitors at the zoo and improve conservation education practices that can also be used in other settings, for example, wildlife tourism. And of course, we can use zoo-based research for animal welfare to assess and improve animal welfare at the zoo, and also with properly established collaborations, we can also use this research to inform animal welfare practices in farms, labs, and any other animal-based industries. Zoo research can help, again, inform conservation efforts, animal welfare, education practices across industries, but we need to strengthen the collaborative efforts across animal-based industries. We should all be working together to improve and understand the welfare of the animals in our care. And as a take-home message, zoo research can lead to an evidence-based husbandry and management, which can then lead to improved animal behavior and welfare at the zoo and other settings. And that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. And I'm here for questions if you have any.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I must admit that we have really learned from you, and we have seen another perspective about zoo animals and zookeeping. Thank you so much. And we have a lot of questions already for you. People are so interested in this topic, and they are sending some of the questions. But let me start from my own question.
Okay.
Thank you. My first question is that people generally believe that keeping animal in zoo is not the best for the animals. Okay. In situ, ex situ, people believe that animals should be in their natural environment. With your years of experience working with zoo animals, what do you have to say to this?
First of all, I can say that I agree that I prefer seeing animals in their natural habitat. So that is for clear. And I can say some of the examples that I've been working with zoos for a while. And again, for me, for many of the animals that I see in zoos, that's been my only opportunity to see many of those animals. Since then, I've been lucky enough to be able, for example, I've been to Tanzania in Africa, of course, in 2016. And that was the first time I finally saw many of the animals I usually see in zoos in the wild: giraffes, elephants, zebras, lions. And it was the most incredible experience. You know, there's no comparison. Seeing an animal in the wild, it's completely different from seeing them in the zoo. It's much better. And I agree, that's where the animals should be, is in the wild, in their natural environment. So that is 100% agree with that. But that doesn't mean that I am against zoos, because unfortunately, in the way things are not so great in the wild, meaning we're facing massive challenges with extinction rate, human wildlife impacts, and animals are not so safe in the wild because of humans, unfortunately, and that is a fact. So keeping animals in zoo, as hopefully I passed that message across with my presentation, can help ensuring that the species stays in the wild. So when we look at animals in zoos, we should think that they are also working as ambassadors for the species. So they are kind of, they're not saying, I should be here and not in the wild. No, they're saying, I'm here and I'm helping my wild counterparts staying there in the wild. Now, again, zoos is a very general term. Not all zoos are the same. Not all zoos have conservation and animal welfare as their top priority. Many do. I've visited many zoos, and many of them do have the animal welfare, conservation, research, and education as priority. Many zoos don't. Many zoos are just pure recreational, institutions. And personally, I'm not big fan of those institutions. I believe if you are to be a zoo, you need to have a benefit for the animals, which could be conservation. It should be ideally all of them: conservation, education. Of course, not all zoos have the same resources, so how much they can invest in different things, it depends how much resources they have to spend. But they should be contributing to something to an extent. Conservation, research, and education, and animal welfare needs to be a priority. But yes, animals should be in the wild, but a good zoo that keeps their animals in the best animal welfare possible and contributes to conservation, education, and research, those zoos are also helping to ensure that animals stay in the wild where they should be.
Thank you so much for your answer, because if you not answer this way, that could have led to my next question. Because keeping animals in zoo, as like you have said in your presentation, helping conserving these animals. Because if all animals are in the wild, especially in Africa, I bet with you that these animals are going into extinction sooner than we can think. Thank you for your answer. So I will go to the chat box for the first question, which is from Oluwasheni Yashere. And the question is, what is the reliability of conducting zoo research using species from different zoos?
It's the reliability. That was the question, correct?
You
Yes,
said
the
what?
reliability.
What was the
of breeding.
reliability?
Yeah.
So I'm guessing the question is how reliable it is for us to use zoo animals for research that relates to wild animals.
From different zoo. Like you said in your previous research that you used 15 zoo. That was the reliability of these results.
Comparing zoos. It is challenging. So because of course zoos are very different and there are many, many confounding variables in there. Because usually when you compare behavior or any other variables across zoos, they're all going to be very different. And it's very difficult to tell what's going on. However, there are methodologies that you can use to help with that. So what I did was exactly that. So I had mouse deer, like I said, very understudied species. It's been in zoos for a while, but not a lot of people have done any research work on them. So I had very little to start with. And when I started looking into it, the question was, why are some zoos breeding them very well and why others are not? And that was what I wanted to find out. But I had no idea what was going on because there was no previous research. So I had to include as many zoos as possible to try and establish that comparison. So what I did was put everything in the mixture. So it was to look at all the variables. The questionnaires itself had to be quite extensive to record as many detail in differences in the enclosure, the management, the diet, the group composition. All of those variables had to be in the questionnaire. And then, I had to put that a bit of modeling as well, put all of those variables and see which one of all those variables were having an effect on behavior and breeding success differences between zoos. So it is possible to do it. It is challenging for it to work. It's ideally you'll have as many zoos as possible to have a solid comparison. And you have to have a methodology that keeps in mind that the zoos will be very different. And you have to address, each of the different variables to see the relative effect on a specific variable, which in this case was behavior and breeding success. So it is possible, it is challenging, but with the right methodology, you can get reliable, accurate results.
Thank you. Olawale is saying thank you for this enlightening presentation, but my concern is on the use of robots in collecting data from animal mass. Can this be used on primate animals in such a way that it won't alter their natural behavior?
Yes, so this can be used in any animal. So the idea can be used in any animal. So the idea of using an evidence-based approach, number one, of continuously monitor and assess their behavior, and then try and use their natural behavior as a base. Now, I also have to warn a bit of warning, because sometimes natural behaviors and natural conditions they overlap a lot with animal welfare, because these are the behaviors the animals evolved in the wild and they are motivated to engage in these behaviors. However, not all natural behaviors, not all natural conditions are good for their welfare, and it may not be very ethical to replicate. For example, animals in the wild may be hungry, thirsty, injured. They may be fighting with each other, which may be very natural, but it's not necessarily good for their welfare if they injure themselves during a fight. So we also have to keep that in mind. Many natural behaviors is great, but we also have to keep in mind what is ethical and what we should be encouraging in captivity, and also, the short and long-term goals. So, for example, if I am to reintroduce that animal, then maybe I will have to replicate some behaviors that maybe result in acute stress, but the animal needs to learn those skills if it is to be reintroduced into the wild. For an animal that is just to stay in the zoo forever, for example, I may want to encourage a lot of natural behaviors in a zoo animal, but usually a natural behavior in a wild animal is that they are terrified of people. That's usually a good thing, that wild animals avoid people, stay away from people. In a zoo, that may be natural, but we don't want a zoo animal to be terrified of people, because that won't be good for their welfare. They will be terrified of anyone that looks at them, and their welfare won't be good. So we also have to keep those things in mind. in general, yes, use the natural behavioral ecology of the animal to inform what you should be encouraging and doing in captivity in the zoo or otherwise. But also keep in mind that not all natural behaviors immediately mean good welfare. Some may be not so good for them, and in those circumstances may not be ethical. It may not be ethical to encourage that behavior specifically. So just a little warning to keep in mind when we're thinking about this. But sorry, I don't think I've addressed the question very well. It can be used with any question. This principle, this methodology can be done with primates. It has been done with primates. Usually primates are relatively well studied in zoos in comparison to other species that are not as charismatic for some people, let's put it that way. So it's been done in primates before. And yes, you can do it across any species. You just have to think of the appropriate behavioral ecology of that species. What makes sense for that species to replicate in captivity? Of course, what works for a penguin is not necessarily what's going to work for a gorilla, right? We have to keep that in mind, what makes sense for each taxon.
Thank you. Katarina is saying, thank you. It was a very interesting talk. I have heard that most zoos keep mostly animals, which are the most attractive for visitors, but not necessarily threatened. I would like to hear your opinion on this.
Yes, so that's true. So I think that's kind of changing a little bit. I mean, there has to be a bit of balance because many zoos are trying to keep as many threatened animals or trying to increase the number of threatened animals they keep for conservation purposes. However, yes, zoos also have to keep a little bit that in mind because, you know, yes, animals should absolutely be the priority in zoos, but we can't forget the visitors. They are the ones that bring the money in, the money that can then be used to improve welfare, to invest in conservation. So we need to attract the visitors and we need to keep them happy. And yes, there is a trend where people do prefer the large, charismatic animals. They do prefer their giraffes, their elephants, their rhinos. You know, a lot of African animals in there for sure. They are, you know, fan favorites at the zoo. People love them. Many of them are threatened, some of them may not. Now, what I can say about keeping non threatened animals, I do agree that ideally zoos will put as much focus on threatened animals as possible. However, there's also a use for keeping non-threatened animals in zoos. So, for example, we can sometimes use non-threatened animals in zoos as proxy for their threatened counterparts. For example, sometimes you may conduct research on a species that is not threatened, but you can use findings to a closely related threatened species, which could be, you know, behavior, learning more about behavior. It may be a species that is very close as much as we are aware in behavioral ecology with a threatened species. And by conducting research on that species, because you have easier access to them, you can then, you know, inform practices in other species. And that also includes sometimes threatened animals are very rare. So when they are even in captivity, there's not a lot of them. And for example, you can again use a species that is not as rare or as threatened, but very common in captivity. And you can really perfect husbandry and management in that species over time. And then when you have the more threatened, rarer species, you already have knowledge on how to keep them, how, best husbandry, best management, how to improve their welfare. And that's a very good starting point because a lot is species specific. Yes, species, even closely related species may change, may be different in behavior, but there's also often overlap as well in the way they behave, in their ecology in the wild, animal health. So, you know, and that's, I can go back again to example with the Iberian lynx. So the Iberian lynx, there's only one zoo that is breeding this species for reintroduction. The other ones are in captive breeding centers, but they are not zoos. They are funded by the government and they are outside public eye. They're being bred outside the public for reintroduction. However, when the Iberian lynx breeding program started, they are almost extinct. And they came into captivity to breed for reintroduction. But because they were so rare, we didn't know a lot about them. Thankfully, zoos had been keeping the Eurasian lynx, which is closely related to Iberian lynx, but far less threatened. And because zoos have been keeping them for years and years, there was a lot of knowledge on them, on behavior, husbandry, health, veterinary practices. And we could use that as a starting point to look after the Iberian lynx when they came into captivity. So I agree, threatened animals should be priority, but that doesn't mean that keeping non-threatened animals is absolutely useless for conservation research, etc. There's also applications and use there.
Another question is here that what does the mating behavior of parrots looks like, and what makes them able to mimic sounds of people other than the other birds?
So mating and behavior
of parrots.
Oh, what it looks like. Well, that depends on the species. In particular, the African grey parrots and the scarlet macaws, they are both mostly socially monogamous. So they pair bond. And then, they obviously rear their offspring together as a pair. But then it depends. There are different courtship behaviors as well, but it's very divergent across species. I haven't seen in the species I worked with, it's there's a bit of a courtship display that the male does, when it's time to mate, but nothing as flashy as I've seen with other species. But yeah, the most prominent thing about mating and breeding behavior in the at least these two species is they pair bond, they develop really strong social bonds, which is very beneficial when they are rearing their offspring, because of course the male contributes greatly to the rearing of the offspring, which is very beneficial for the female in this case. So yeah, I think that's the most prominent thing about their breeding behavior. Very strong social bonds that have been compared to those of primates. So they have the ability to develop really, really strong social bonds, which it really helps with that pair bonding in the long term.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if this applies to other parts of the world, but Africans believe that keeping zoo, there must be supernatural power used in controlling the wild animal to be kept in zoos. I don't know if this belief is true from your experience as a zookeeper, and Adola wants to know what you think about having supernatural power in controlling animal kept in the zoo.
Well, of course, that will be according to each person's beliefs, each to their own. Personally, I don't go necessarily with supernatural abilities. I go more with, of course, when you're working with an animal, number one, when you develop knowledge about the behavior of the animal, I guess you have a superpower, which is a sensitivity to interpret the behavior of that animal. And that can be done in general for a species. So, for example, with the mouse deer, when I started looking at them, they are so understudied that I was like, I didn't know what they were doing ever. By the time I finished my study with, I think, 500 hours of behavioral observations, I could tell, sometimes I could tell that animal is about to urinate, because I got so sensitive to that behavior that I could determine their little cues before they engage in some behavior. And that is true for zookeepers, and not just with the species, but with the particular behaviors. Many zookeepers develop a bond with the animals they work with those animals every day, so they know the behavior of their animals. And I think that may be what this belief of supernatural power, which is they're just really familiar with what the behavior is of the animals they're looking after. So they kind of, and there's also animal training. So because of the bond they develop with the animal, and now we have animal training. I'm not saying animal training for tricks and anything like that. I'm saying animal training for procedures, which is part of modern husbandry practices, which include, for example, training an animal to voluntarily give the arm to, collect blood. And that's done with many primates, and or teaching a polar bear to open the mouth for dental checks voluntarily. And that's the kind of training that is conducted to reduce stress with health checks on the animals. And I guess, that because the animal is trained and has a bond with the keeper, it may seem that there's a bit of a superpower. And I guess there is a superpower. It is very powerful to have that knowledge of the behavior of the animals. Whether, it's a supernatural event, I guess that it's to each person's belief, but it's not my own.
Yeah, thank you. Matthew is asking that, was there any record of successful captive breeding in African gray parrots? Where and when? Is there any record of that?
Absolutely. No. There are species that are difficult to breed in captivity, but it's not the case of the African gray parrots. I mean, they do have their requirements, obviously, and that meaning that they're breeding in some circumstances, it does not necessarily that their welfare is amazing, but they are commonly kept as pets. There are people that keep them in their backyard, and they breed them. So it's not difficult to breed these species in captivity, but whether that species is being provided with everything it needs for good welfare, that's a different story. They may be breeding successfully in some circumstances and still their welfare not be great. It's possible to have successful breeding, maybe an indicator of welfare kind of in some species, but often I don't think it's a very reliable indicator because many species can breed successfully in really appalling welfare conditions. So it's not one I would use as a welfare indicator, but they do breed in zoos, in sanctuaries, or when even kept as pets in the pet trade. So it's not a species that is particularly difficult to breed in captivity. Others are, but not the African grays. No.
Thank you. I quickly want to, you said in your presentation and over again that there's possibility of using animal in zoo to repopulate the natural environment. Olide is asking that their behavior in the zoo, that some of them will have lacked some natural behavior. Will this affect their behavior in the wild when they are being repopulated?
So, number one, yes, it is possible to reintroduce zoo animals in the wild. Yes, there is a concern that they won't have the necessary behaviors to survive and reproduce and thrive in the wild. Um, Usually, it depends on the species. It depends how much the behavior of the species is instinctive or innate or learned. So, for species that have depend mostly on instinctive innate behaviors when they're born, so precocial species, for example, it's easier to reintroduce them because they don't rely as much on behaviors they learn, you know, to survive. They just have those behaviors naturally, instinctively. However, many species do develop much of their behavior based on social learning, what they learn from conspecifics or from personal experience. And if they are in a very sheltered environment in a zoo, and their conspecifics are also captive animals that don't themselves have the right wild behaviors, then the behavior that animal is developing is not appropriate for survival into the wild. So usually we have to be quite careful. So even there are many zoos that are involved in reintroduction programs, but again, depending on the species, what they do is often they keep those animals in behind the scenes enclosure. So the animals that are on show for the visitors are often not the animals that will be released into the wild. They may be part of the breeding program, and then their offspring may be put in a different facility off show so they can be away from people, learning how to be wild with behavioral monitoring and trying to encourage the right behaviors, with specific protocols for encourage, I don't know, foraging behaviors. Some of them need anti-predator training, so they need to be exposed to predator models, often not the actual predator, but something that looks and sounds like the predator, and give them a negative reaction to that predator. So they learn, okay, if I see that, that's bad. I have to react. So there are a lot of steps that we have to make sure that the animals will be when they are released, they're ready to, function. And there is, a worry. It's one of the challenges of reintroducing animals from captivity in general. But it can be done, if it's done properly and we keep in mind all the effects captivity can have on the animals and we try to mitigate those effects. It is possible, and it's been successful in many circumstances. Many zoo housed animals have been successfully released into the wild and helped in the recovery of the species.
Thank you. Katharina is saying, I am wondering how you deal with replication in zoo research. what we do in farm animal welfare research is that we have exactly the same pen with exactly same condition, control versus treatment, but you cannot do this in zoo, right? What do you have to say about condition in your
Yes, so
research?
that's definitely one of the main challenges of zoo research. It's very difficult to control for confounding variables. It's not, you cannot control for all the variables like we do well in labs, and but other type of research can be difficult as well. But you usually can control for them a bit more. It is difficult to do replications. Sample size is also a challenge. With zoo-based research. Not everyone, for example, for the mouse there, I managed to do a multi-zoo study, but not everyone can go to 15 zoos in 9 countries to collect data. It's quite challenging. So when it's a possibility, so when it's possible to do so, great. You can compare different zoos and look at different things. But if not, if you're just conducting research on a few animals in one zoo, it's still valuable. Case studies are very, very valuable for us to advance our knowledge, but it is a challenge. And the answer is you work with what you have. Um, on the bright side of zoos, usually studies in zoos are more ecologically valuable than studies in laboratories, for example, because even though you don't control as well for, you can't control the confounding variables and all of that, but if you have an animals in enclosures that replicate quite well their natural environment to an extent, of course, then the behavior, for example, if you're doing a behavioral study, then what you're actually seeing is more likely to be closer to their natural behavior than if you're conducting a study in a lab in very artificial conditions. So, zoo-based research has those two downsides. And the way you deal with it, you do the best you can with that. You acknowledge the confounding variables. You acknowledge that depending on how much power you have for the claims you're making from your findings. If you don't, you don't. You just say, the data suggests that the enrichment was effective. That actually happened with my PhD because COVID had a massive impact on delaying some of my work on my PhD, and unfortunately ended up adding confounding variables to my study, which were very unwelcome. But I worked with what I had. When I wasn't, when I was quite confident it was the modifications, great. If there was a potential for interference from confounding variables, I did the best I could. I acknowledged those confounding variables, and I mentioned, it is possible they also played a big role in the results obtained. It's the best I can do with what I have, and the results are still, valuable.
Thank you. And the last question from me here is immobilization and sedating drugs for handlings of animals in the zoo.
Yeah.
Do you think this comply with animal welfare?
So immobilization for health reasons, for health checks?
For handling, immobilization and sedating drugs for handlings of animals.
Okay. Well, I mean, if there's no other way, we do what we can, right? I mean, if you need to do a veterinary check on an animal because, for a reason or the other, because of course, if the animal is sick or ill, the welfare is not going to be great either. And you need a health check or a veterinary intervention, or, to move the animal to other zoo. If there's no other option and that's the best you can do, perfect. However, what modern zoos are trying to do is to try to then incorporate this animal training with positive reinforcement, for this kind of procedures. So procedures that you don't necessarily have to immobilize the animal, like getting blood, checking teeth, or something like that, or even weighing the animal. Animals have been trained to stepping on scales, so you can easily weigh the animal where the animal is voluntarily going on the scale, obviously for some sort of reward, but they're going on the scale and you can weigh the animal. The animal is doing a voluntary behavior. It's his choice. You're not forcing it, and you're still getting the data you want, which is, the weight or blood samples or the teeth look fine. So if that's an option, that's what we should be doing without stressing, immobilizing the animal if we can. If there's no other option, sometimes there isn't. There's some vet and health checks that we just have to do it. And, it's not ideal, but again, we're not going to let the animal be sick and ill. If we have to intervene, we have to intervene.
Yeah. At this point, I would like to join Augustine, Ogogo, Weto, Matthew, and Sanusi to thank you for a wonderful presentation today. We have actually learned a lot from you, and we hope that subsequently you will be joining our webinars. Thank you so much for this presentation. I hand over to the coordinator.
Thank you so much once again to our guest speaker and to the audience for staying up till this point, despite exceeding the time of the meeting. But I'll just take one or two comments from the audience because they may want to say one or two things to our presenter. So with that, I will invite Fami. Fami, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is my voice clear?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Dr. Yasser, for the opportunity. I always be excited to join Animal Welfare Group Nigeria webinars. And now I am more excited to see Dr. Ricardo here. Hi, Dr. Ricardo. I am Fahmi that sent you a message on LinkedIn because I just want to say thanks very much because you have inspired me for doing animal behavior and welfare research. And it brought me to my bachelor's and master's degree, and I had presented it also in Animal Welfare Group Nigeria last March. And yeah, I just want to thank for it, and I hope that all of us can see your contribution to animal welfare, animal behavior, and also for the conservation of the animals. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Yasser.
Thank you very much. That's really nice. Thank you.
The last one from me, Ricardo. The zoo scientist, is it open to anybody to join, or are there any rules or criteria? Can you please talk, because we have some zookeepers here, if they're interested, and how they can join you?
Well, the zoo scientist is not really join. It's just, I mean, anyone can access the website. All the resources are free for everyone. So just visit the website and it's free to anyone. And we're also on social media. So LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. So you can just follow the page and all the resources are free to anyone. So there's no joining. It's just okay. Follow us and enjoy the resources.
Okay, thank you so much. So with that, we come to the end of today's webinar, and our next webinar will be in 2 weeks' time. Thank you everybody for staying tuned. So with that, I would like to say bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
So much.